In a previous video, we covered creating queued mailer actions. So that included creating a form to take an email notification and then specifying users, and then when you click send, you would get a number of jobs in a queue, and then in the background you would run a worker process and send those emails from that queue and trigger a mail send with that information. This video is going to use just queued jobs, so it's slightly different, and we're going to go through the differences in the way the messages are formatted and how to create a job in the CakePHP plugin. So to get started, let's start with creating a command. Let me just turn off our processor for the email queue there. So we're going to start with creating a command. So bake command, and we're going to call that the add user command, because what we'll be doing is adding a user to the database and then notifying, using the job queue, and then notifying if there's an error. So we have our add user command. Now we also need, of course, we're making a queued job, so we're going to create a job named add user as well, which then appears here. And our first task is to define the arguments that we want for our command to take. So we're going to take an email argument as the first argument, and that is a required argument, so I'll just say true. And you can define help, and then you can take in a full name and say and we want that to be in quotes just so people know, and then finally make sure it's okay. So if we now view our app section after trying to run bin cake, we'll see that we've got an add user command, and when we go to run it, it will tell us if there's any errors first, and of course putting true in quotes will create a problem. So let's now have a look at that. So now it's saying a missing argument is required, and again we just need to specify that is correct, and might just go and have a look at my table and see if there's already these records exist, which they do. and we'll just clean the database up so that it's not got anything that we're going to try and create later. Now, the next step is that we need to add a job to the queue. So we need to take these arguments and then send them to our Redis queue for later for them to be attempted to insert in the database. Now that is, if we look at our documentation, what is required is, just scroll down a little bit, is we simply use our queue manager and then use the push method and then pass in the class that's going to be doing the job of processing the data that we pass in. So that requires a reference to queue manager. So if we look up the top, we've used queue manager and then we say push. Now the class that we're going to using, the job class is add user job, and just specify it like that. Now we need to define some data to push onto this queue, and that data will be the get the arguments from the command here, and let's just look at it when we've passed it in. So it's going to be a index array with the email first, so we can define our email as the first argument passed in and our full name as the second argument, and then just use compact, and that will, if we debug it, dump and die, that will get fairly what we want. Now it's going to be a little different, yeah, so that's what we want, and we're doing it like this because we don't have to do any changes when we convert it to an entity and those sorts of things. So pop this into here, and then we're going to create another queue configuration, because the layout of the queue manager, just standard jobs, and is not exactly the same as the mailer messages, so we're going to have a look at that as well. So I'm just going to say in our configuration, our options array, I'm just going to say, instead of pushing it onto the default queue, which we're sort of using for mailer actions, we'll send it to a different queue. So that configuration is configured in our app local file. So we've got our default queue pushing to Redis, the queue name's default, and it's using a listener of worker listener here. And however, this queue, which I've added already, is the add user configuration, and the queue name's going to be add user, and it's going to use a different listener class because of the different formatting of the messages and those sorts of things, but just to log things out using the listener. So let's go and have a look at the listener class just to make sure that we're going to just copy the current listener that's already listening for events from the default queue, and this new add user worker listener will listen for events from the add user queue. So again, it's just simply a class that's got a list of methods it responds to, events it responds to, and then the method name to call. Now at the moment this is being configured for the email jobs, mailer action jobs, and this will error out if we don't do that, don't make this change. So just going to say instead of responding to, we're just going to log out the method, and just so it's really explicit, job add user job queue. So when that happens, we'll know exactly what it is being triggered there. So notice here that it's passing in an event, and we'll look at the format of the messages from both the mailer queue and the job queue style of messages, because they're slightly different, and that matters when you start to peel them open and want to get things out of them for processing. Now we've got to the point where we've got our queue configured, we've got a custom listener. We just need to make sure as well that this class does exist, otherwise it will error out. Just making sure that's right, and that's good. So now let's go back to our add user command and making sure that it's got the correct settings, and that's all that's needed to push a job onto the queue. Now let's go and start to flesh out our job. So in our add user job, we want to get a reference to our users table so we can insert the user. We also want to get a reference to our mailer so that if it fails we can send a mail, and we'll be using the notify mailer that we created for our queuing, our mailer queue jobs, and that's what's required there for the use statements for these couple of traits. Next step, let's get a reference to the users table. So this fetch table, and it's the users table that those usernames and emails are stored in. And then we've got to get our data outs from the message. So remember, we're passing this into the message, so pushing it onto the queue, and the message will contain this information. So here we go, message get, in this case it's not get arguments, it's get arguments, but it returns that the arguments that are being passed in. And now we need to create a new user entity. So we use the new entity method and just pass it that username and full name and email array. The next step is grabbing a table save method and then passing it the user entity that's been created. Now when it tries to save, it will validate, and the validation that will be triggered, so we've got a reference to the users table there. So having a look at the users table, the validation that will be triggered will be, firstly, that it will need to be an email address that's passed in as the email value, and then we've got these requirements here for the full name. And then finally, in the application rules, Cake has automatically baked this rule, and it says that the email address must be unique. So let's create a message to make sure. We'll say the email address must be unique. And just so that we really know that that's the message that's being generated there, will make it really explicit that this is our custom message that we've added. Going back to our job, so now when we attempt to save, it will validate with the users table. If it returns false, it's failed. So what we now want to do is to return a formatted string, which is all the errors that are coming through. Now, when it fails, the user entity will have inside it all the errors. And so this piece of code, all it's doing is we want to use the hash method and get all the array values, because that's those array values equate to these error messages. So if there's multiple, it will have all those values in an array, these array values. And then finally, just using another one of the CakePHP text utility methods, we'll join them together, and it will be error 1, error 2, and then it would do this if there was 3 errors. So yeah, it just makes a nicely formatted list of each of the errors. Now, as we mentioned, we're going to be sending, if there's an error, we're going to be sending another mailer job to the notify mailer and sending a job via the queuing server to notify via email. So to do that, we're getting a reference to our mailer. Now this here is just type hinting. If I don't type hint this, what will happen is I won't be able to then use my autocomplete with my editor. So I've just added that so that I get the auto completion, so it knows that because this is a queue enabled mailer, you need to type in it so that you can get this auto completion. So what we're going to do here, we're going to send inside that mailer, we're going to create a failed action that will then take a couple of things. We're going to take firstly, from the data that's passed in, there's going to be an email address, and there's going to be a full name, and finally we want to pass through the errors. It's more explicit, it could be errors, so let's say that, to this mailer class here. And that is getting close to being right. Now let's go to our notify mailer and create a method called failed that will take in the email address and more precisely the full name, and finally it's not going to be an array of information here, it's going to be a string, and it will just be the errors that are being generated by the failure, if there is one. So our set 2, we're not sending it back to the user that we're, so we might say, okay, send it back to an administration address. Just to make it really simple, we're not going to set different templates and those sorts of things. We're going to say adding user, and then the user will be, we can make it, and some error messages, so the third argument will be that. So we'll go adding user, full name, email address, and errors. And we'll tell the mailer to grab hold of the view builder and say set the templates to null, and all we're going to get is a subject and that in our email that we get instead of everything else. Now we can make this nice by passing an array. And nicely format our email descriptive name there. And that's all that's required to send a notification from our job here. So going from the top again, we'll get the message off the queue, open the message and get the arguments. With those arguments, create a new entity, and then if that entity save fails, then send a message to the other email queue, which is using the default queue. So we could change this here as well. Let's just add some more here just to show you a little bit more of what's available here. We can say we can set headers, so we can say X add user failed header, and say something like that, and then we could say be very explicit and say, look, we want to explicitly say that we're putting it onto the default queue, which would happen anyway. So now we also have to be alert that what we're doing at the moment, we're saying if it fails, do this, but then it's falling through to saying processor acknowledgement, and that would be sent to the listener as a success. So we also want at the end of our method where it's failed to pull in our processor and send a reject back. Now if we said requeue, that would mean that there was logic within the job to be able to figure out what was wrong and then rerun the job at the next time a worker picked it up from the queue. But we don't have that. We know that it's going to be a hard failure, so we say reject. Now if you don't do that, weird things will start happening. Another thing is if your code throws an exception, just have a look at the queuing documentation, because if we have a look here, right, so again, here we go. This is where it is. It says the maximum number of times the job may be requested as a result of an exception or by explicitly returning processor requeue. If provided, this value will override the value provided in the worker command line if a value is not provided by the job or by the command line option, the job may be requeued an infinite number of times. So looking at that, if an exception occurs, there's going to be a requeue event happen. So it says here, it says the result of an exception is, or explicitly returning a processor requeue. The exception causes a requeue. So just remember that when you go to do your code. If an exception's thrown, it will be like an explicit requeue, and then the job will continue to be in the. So you might want to do things like handle exceptions in your code by putting it in a try catch to stop that specific problem from happening. So now we've got all the code we need to be able to respond to our errors and those sorts of things with a mail job. Let's attempt to run our job here, and what we'll do is we've just run it. It doesn't seem like it's done anything. Let's have a look. So it's actually run the job, and what we'll do at this point is we'll just have a look at running the worker for the add user queue. So with that, we'll just make a split terminal here and hide our window there to make things bigger. So running a worker for a different queue, we can, if we have a look at our arguments here, we can specify a queue, or we can specify a configuration. Now, probably better to specify the configuration. So let's do that. So it's the add user configuration, because you get all those settings instead of just specifying the queue. And we need to, as we said, create a processor. Always make a processor name so it doesn't generate a random one. So now that we do that, we can see that we've hit in our worker listener here, we've got our message here. We might just make that one also go blue because it's a success, it's not an error. And we can see that it's done what it's needed to do. Now, if we go back to our notify our users index page, we can see that it's added our record to the database. If we try again, let's try that once more, and notice that it's hit this block of code that's saying something's failed, and then it's returned a reject, and that's there triggered the processor message reject block of code in our listener. So our code works, and we need to now look at whether this mailer function has pushed onto a queue. So let's just refresh, and we can see that the mailer action has actually been run. Now, just so we can compare the difference, so we're just on our queue here, we've got a mailer action in this queue. Let's turn off our worker that's pulling from the add user queue, and then add another job to the queue using our command. And now if we refresh, we can see we've got an add user job, and which is running just the job class, and a mailer job here as well. So let's have a look at the differences of them by going into, firstly, I've got some code here that will, so I've got these Java Node, a bit of Node code here. So what we're going to do is just create by copying firstly the mailer job. So let's go here and paste that in. And then we will run a little bit of Node code here. Let's get a terminal up, go into our JS utilities. So it's going to save it to output of mailer job there. So I'm going to go Node job output and just do that and format our document there. So there we have the output of our mailer job. Let's go and get one from our just standard job message, and go back to here, and doesn't really, and this is the add user job, and we'll call that add user job example, and then we've created another one here, and right, we've opened it already, so let's format it. Right, so let's get rid of that and close that, and now we have this, okay, output mailer, here we go. Let's close a few of these things, and now we're going to look at the differences between our different jobs. So notice that this is a mailer enabled action job, so it takes a class of mailer job, but then it passes into that mailer job class the actual mailer that you're using and the action that you're calling. Notice here how it's passing in arguments here so that it can pass those into this failed action. And with this one, we created a header that add some custom headers to the email, maybe for tracking or whatever you'd like to do there. So that's the format of the mailer job. It's got args, and then you'll have to, once you get the arguments from the message, you need to then go one step further and get the arguments inside here if you're trying to access these type of things. And again, we've got a data section here which pretty much duplicates this as well. And the rest is just the envelope, if you like, for Redis queuing, and that is the mailer job there. So the job message is a little bit different. It's got this direct reference to the class that we've created and the execute method, and then it's just the args and straight here. So it's a little bit different. You're not referencing args within this argument section here if you're peeling it open. So if we're going to do that, so that means it's slightly different. So if I get my add user worker listener up and put this back here, I know that if I'm going to say there's been a successful message with this, I've got slightly different coding to get the message out of here. So firstly we're getting the message, but this time we don't need to access it by index, because it's now going to be just the email here, and then we can grab the full name here, and we can say successfully added user, and there we go. So yeah, that's the different formats of the message: a job message and an email message. Just be aware that there's slight differences to the layout of them. Okay, so let's get back to where we were, and yep, so we get our terminals back, and we go back to our terminals here that have, so we've got three, we'll create another terminal, split terminal here as well, so we'll create another one, and now we're going to start to see both queues working as we process messages from them. So we'll just get firstly our add user queue working, and next we'll get our email queue, which is the default queue, working in it, and we can see that it's just processed the messages that were in the queue. And now let's try and create an unsuccessful message, because this email address already exists in the database. Notice the messages we get. So we get from our add user job, we can see that because there's a duplicate email, it's returning a processor reject and forwarding to the mail queue an email to let us know. So let's have a look at those emails, and here we can see that it's we should say failed, shouldn't we, really, there, but you get the point. The email address must be unique, and there's our custom message there. Then if we have a look at the source, we can see that we've got our custom headers and things like that. Obviously, with the mailer action, you could add templates and pass in variables and do all sorts of things and really make the message meaningful, but this is just an example. And so again, we can see we've still got the ability with our mail queue to pass in multiple messages and notify, and then see those messages come through, and with HTML format emails and plain text if you want, those sorts of things. And also we now want to create we've created an unsuccessful one, as you can see there, because it's failing, it's message reject there. Now let's create one that's going to be successful, and we can see that our listener, as we've opened up the message to give ourselves a nice error message there, and we notice that it doesn't send an error message in this right hand screen at all. But then when we try and add it again, you can see that both queues are processing jobs as they should. Now, just a word of caution, and it gets probably all of us, I suppose, is that whenever you make a code change, you need to restart your workers. And one way of making sure that you don't ever have stale workers is by specifying, either max jobs or max runtime when you're starting your workers, and then maybe restarting the worker using cron or something, and so every 5 minutes or whatever, so that they exit themselves, and then they'll automatically pick up the fresh code the next time they run. So we've looked at CakePHP queue plugin and just the job functionality in this video. I hope it is going to be useful to you some way.